The cold judge and the silent twins. The heavy wooden gavel struck down like thunder, sharp and decisive. Judge Evelyn Monroe barely blinked as she passed her latest ruling, her voice crisp and unwavering. 6 months in county jail. Next case. The defendant, a young man barely in his 20s, slumped in his chair, shoulders curling inward like a wounded animal. His public defender patted his arm awkwardly, as if that could somehow soften the blow. Officer Gray Harris, a seasoned bailiff who had served in Monroe's courtroom for years, placed a firm but gentle hand on the young man's shoulder and led him out. As he passed by the stenographer's desk, he caught a hushed conversation between two clerks. "She used to be different, you know," one murmured over a steaming cup of coffee. "Before her son died," the other whispered back. "She smiled more. Talked to people." "How long has it been now?" 3 years this spring. Poor woman hasn't been the same since." Greg didn't stop, didn't let his face betray the weight of those words, but he remembered. He had been there that rainy afternoon when the judge stood at the gravesite. Dry-eyed, while the heavens wept for her, he had watched as she returned to work 2 days later. More steel than flesh, more ice than heart. But Judge Monroe never acknowledged the whispers. She never did. She adjusted her glasses and flipped open the next case file. Liam and Lucas Carter. Her lips tightened slightly. Child custody hearings weren't unusual, but something about the sparse details in the file made her pause. No legal representation. No living family members. CPS was recommending immediate placement into state care. Her gaze lifted as the courtroom doors creaked open. 2 tiny figures walked inside, guided by a court officer. They were small, so small. 2 identical boys, no older than 6, stood in the middle of the vast courtroom. Their dark brown eyes darted around warily, their hands tightly clasped together, as if afraid they would disappear if they let go. Judge Monroe felt a strange tightness in her chest. She had seen hardened criminals stand before her with less fear than these children. Taking a controlled breath, she straightened in her chair. "Who speaks for these children?" she asked. Silence. The twins remained motionless, their small faces blank except for the deep, haunted shadows under their eyes. The court clerk fumbled with a few papers before answering. "Your Honor, Child Protective Services couldn't send a representative today, but they submitted a written report." Judge Monroe exhaled sharply through her nose. That was typical. CPS was overwhelmed, overworked, and understaffed. She picked up the report and skimmed through it quickly. Both parents deceased. Car accident. The boys had no immediate relatives willing to take them in. They had been placed in multiple foster homes, but none had lasted more than a few months. Behavioral issues, the file said. Trouble bonding. Now CPS was recommending placement in a group home. Judge Monroe's fingers tightened around the paper. She had seen this pattern before. Children like this, bouncing from home to home, often ended up lost in the system. Forgotten. Discarded. Something dark and unfamiliar stirred in her chest. She turned her attention back to the boys. Liam, the twin on the left, shuffled his feet slightly, his fingers gripping the hem of his oversized sweater. Lucas, standing beside him, squeezed his brother's hand even tighter. Judge Monroe studied them carefully. "Do you understand why you're here?" The boys hesitated, exchanging a glance. Finally, Liam nodded. "They want to send us away again," he said softly. Judge Monroe arched a brow. "To a new home," she corrected. "To a safe place." Lucas bit his lip. "That's what they said last time." A flicker of something almost like guilt twisted in her stomach. She had seen too many cases like this before. Children shuffled between homes, each move leaving another scar. Before she could respond, Liam took a step forward. His fingers trembled as he reached up and wiped at his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Then, in a voice so small it barely reached her ears, he whispered, "Can you be our new mommy?" The courtroom went completely silent. The air seemed to shift, heavy with something unspoken. Even the clerks, the officers, everyone froze. Judge Monroe felt her heart lurch violently against her ribs. She hadn't expected this. She wasn't prepared for this. For the first time in years, she didn't know what to say. She had sentenced men to prison without hesitation. She had broken apart families with a single signature. She had delivered verdicts that sealed the fates of countless people. But now, faced with two tiny, lost boys looking at her as if she were their last hope, she faltered. "Who told you to say that?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Liam sniffled and shook his head. "Nobody." Lucas's lower lip trembled. "We just..." He hesitated. "We don't want to go with those people again." Judge Monroe swallowed hard. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. She wasn't supposed to care. She was supposed to follow the law. But as she looked into their pleading brown eyes, something inside her, something buried beneath years of grief and duty, began to crack. And for the first time in a long, long time, Judge Monroe hesitated. The ice begins to crack. The silence in the courtroom stretched. It was thick, suffocating, pressing down on Judge Evelyn Monroe's chest in a way she hadn't felt in years. Liam and Lucas stood in front of her, two tiny boys clinging to each other like they were the only things keeping each other standing. "Can you be our new mommy?" Their words echoed in her mind, louder than the sound of her own gavel, louder than any plea for mercy she had ever heard. She gripped the sides of her bench as if grounding herself, willing her voice to remain steady. "That's not how this works," she finally said. Liam lowered his gaze, his little shoulders drooping as if he'd expected the answer, but still wished it had been different. Lucas, the quieter of the two, looked up at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "But we don't have anyone else," he whispered. Something about the way he said it sent a sharp pain through her chest. She had spent years mastering the art of detachment. She had built her reputation on being fair, unwavering, immune to emotion. She had stood before criminals, grieving parents, and shattered families, and never once had she let herself get pulled in. She couldn't afford to. But this was different. These were children. Two little boys, lost and alone, staring up at her with desperation no child should ever have to feel. She forced herself to look away, flipping through their case file once more. It was thin, far too thin for two children who had suffered so much. A car accident had taken their parents 6 months ago. Since then, they'd been bounced between multiple foster homes, each one less stable than the last. The notes from Child Protective Services were clinical, lacking the emotion she could clearly see in front of her. Children show difficulty in adjusting, exhibit attachment issues, struggle to form bonds with new guardians. Translation: they were difficult. They didn't trust easily. They had already learned the hard way that love came with conditions. She turned to the CPS recommendation, stake facility placement. Her stomach turned. She knew what that meant. A group home. A place where they would be one of many. Where they would be overlooked, lost in a system that barely had the resources to care. She had seen it before. She had ruled on too many cases like this before. She exhaled slowly and turned back to the boys. "You don't have any other relatives?" Lucas shook his head. "No family friends." Liam's voice was barely above a whisper. "Nobody wants us." A sharp pain lanced through her chest. She knew what it was like to feel unwanted. To feel alone. It had been 3 years since she lost her son. 3 years since she buried the only piece of her heart that had ever truly belonged to someone else. The grief had hardened her, reshaped her into someone who no longer felt things too deeply. She had told herself that she was doing what was necessary, surviving. But as she looked at Liam and Lucas, something inside her was shifting, breaking apart piece by piece. She could not, would not, let them disappear into the system. She cleared her throat. "Has anyone explained to you what happens next?" Liam hesitated before nodding. "They're sending us to a place with a lot of other kids, like the last place." Lucas's fingers tightened around his brother's. "You didn't like it there." Lucas's eyes welled up again, but he didn't cry. "They don't like us." They don't listen, Liam added. They just wait for us to be bad so they can move us again. Judge Monroe's hand curled into a fist on the bench. She knew this system. She had fought against it. And she had lost too many times. This wasn't just about two little boys standing in front of her. This was about every child the system had failed. And for the first time in years, Judge Evelyn Monroe realized she could not be just a bystander. She sat back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the wooden desk. "The law says I can't simply take you home," she said carefully. "But that doesn't mean I can't help you." Both boys looked up, hope flickering in their eyes. "I want to make sure you're placed somewhere safe," she continued. "Somewhere where you'll be cared for. But I need time to do that. And I need to know you'll trust me to make the right decision." Liam and Lucas exchanged a look. "We trust you," Lucas whispered. She felt something deep inside her shift. It had been years since anyone had trusted her with something other than passing judgment. She took a deep breath. Then, in a move that shocked everyone in the courtroom, including herself, she made a decision that would change everything. She looked at her bailiff. "Officer Harris, place these boys under emergency judicial guardianship." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. The clerk stopped typing. The attorneys gaped. Even Harris blinked in shock. "Your Honor." Her voice didn't waver. "They are not going to a group home," she said. "Not today." A slow murmur rippled through the room. Lucas's lip quivered. "Does that mean we can stay with you?" She hesitated. She had just thrown the weight of the law aside for them. She had made a choice that went against every cold, calculated decision she had made since her son died. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a mistake. She leaned forward, meeting their small, hopeful gazes. "It means I'm not going to let you disappear," she said firmly. "Not as long as I have anything to say about it." And as the gavel struck down again, the courtroom buzzed with the knowledge that, today, something more powerful than the law had spoken. For the first time in a long time, Judge Evelyn Monroe had chosen family. The weight of a choice, the weight of the gavel's final echo still lingered in the air, but the silence that followed was deafening. Judge Evelyn Monroe had made her ruling. Now she had to live with it. The murmurs in the courtroom rose into a low hum of disbelief. Court clerks exchanged wide-eyed glances. A few attorneys whispered to each other, some furiously scribbling notes. The stenographer's fingers hovered over the keys, as if unsure whether to record what had just happened. Judge Monroe wasn't the kind of judge to make emotional decisions. She wasn't the kind of person to let feelings dictate the law. And yet today, she had. Officer Greg Harris, her longtime bailiff, hesitated before stepping forward. His years of service under her strict rulings had never prepared him for this. "Your Honor." His voice was low, cautious. "Are you sure about this?" Monroe's jaw tightened. She looked at Liam and Lucas, their small hands still clasped together, their eyes flickering with something fragile. Hope. She couldn't take that back. "I don't make decisions I'm not sure about, Officer Harris." That wasn't entirely true. This wasn't a calculated ruling. It wasn't the type of verdict she was used to delivering. This was a choice made not from law, but from something deeper. Something she had buried for years. Something that had awoken inside her the moment she heard those words. "Can you be our new mommy?" She inhaled sharply and turned to the clerk. "File an emergency stay on their placement in the group home." The woman, still stunned, nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." Monroe turned to the CPS worker standing near the side of the courtroom, a wiry man in his early 50s, his expression already clouded with irritation. "Miss Corbett," she addressed the social worker in charge of Liam and Lucas's case, "I trust you'll process the emergency guardianship paperwork immediately." Corbett pursed her lips, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly unusual." Judge Monroe folded her hands over the bench. "So is abandoning two children to a broken system." Corbett stiffened. "It's not abandoning them. It's following protocol." Protocol that has failed them multiple times already, Monroe shot back. Unless you'd like me to bring that up in a judicial review. A long pause. Corbett's jaw tensed. No, Your Honor. Monroe gave a firm nod. Then we're done here. She picked up her gavel to signal adjournment. Before she could strike it down, a voice rang through the courtroom. This is highly inappropriate. Monroe looked up. The voice belonged to a woman sitting in the second row of the courtroom gallery. Attorney Meredith Clark. One of the state's top child welfare attorneys, Clark was known for her ruthless efficiency and strict adherence to the law. A home, a battle, a reckoning. The corridors of the courthouse stretched long and empty, the polished floors reflecting the dull glow of the overhead lights. Each step Judge Evelyn Monroe took echoed, but the weight of two small hands in hers drowned out every other sound. Liam's grip was firm, uncertain but trusting. Lucas clung to her hesitantly, as if expecting at any moment that she might change her mind. Monroe didn't. She couldn't. She had spent her entire career believing that justice was a rigid structure, black and white, right and wrong, a balance of law and consequence. But today, she had shattered her own rules, and she wasn't sure what that meant for her future. She led the boys out of the courthouse, past security, past the murmuring onlookers who whispered among themselves about the judge who had just done the unthinkable. As the cold evening air hit her skin, she turned to the boys. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Lucas's stomach answered before he did, a soft, involuntary growl. A small, embarrassed smile flickered across his lips. Monroe exhaled, her heart tightening. "Come on," she said, leading them toward her car. She wasn't a mother. Not anymore. Not for a long time. But tonight, these boys weren't going to bed hungry. Not while she had anything to say about it. The weight of a home. Monroe's house was nothing like what the boys were used to. It was clean, orderly. Every piece of furniture was precisely placed. No clutter, no mess, no warmth. It was a home designed for someone who lived alone. And for years, that had suited her just fine. But tonight, as she set plates on the dining table and watched Liam and Lucas sit stiffly in their chairs, uncertain, as if afraid to touch anything, it hit her. This house wasn't made for children. She didn't even have a television in the living room. When was the last time she had heard laughter in these walls? "Eat," she said, setting the food in front of them. They hesitated. She didn't know why until she saw it. The way Liam glanced at Lucas's plate first. The way Lucas nudged his portion slightly toward his brother. She realized, with a sick feeling, that they were used to rationing, to making sure the other had enough before eating for themselves. Her throat tightened. "You don't have to share," she said gently. "There's plenty." Liam studied her as if testing whether she was lying. Then finally, he took a bite. And for the first time since leaving the courthouse, his shoulders eased, just slightly. Monroe watched them eat, trying to ignore the burning ache in her chest. How long had they been starving? How long had they been waiting for someone, anyone, to care? She swallowed the lump in her throat. This was going to be harder than she thought. The storm brewing. The first sign of trouble came an hour later. Her phone rang. She knew who it would be before she even checked the caller ID. Meredith Clark. With a deep breath, she picked up. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," Clark said, her voice sharp and unwavering. Monroe closed her eyes. "Good evening to you too, Meredith. You've overstepped in a way that's unprecedented. I've already filed a complaint with the Judicial Ethics Board." Monroe's grip on the phone tightened. "So I gathered." Clark scoffed. "You're a judge, Monroe, not a social worker. You can't just take children because you feel sorry for them." A pause. Then Monroe said, her voice steady, "I didn't take them. I saved them." Clark laughed coldly. "You think that's how the system works. You're delusional. The department is already planning to contest your emergency guardianship ruling. You'll be investigated, and when they find that you've compromised your role as a judge, You will be removed from the bench." Monroe felt her heart hammer. She had expected pushback, but hearing the words out loud made it real. Her career, her entire life's work, was about to be ripped apart because she had dared to care. She looked across the room at the two small boys curled up on her couch. Lucas had finally started to doze off, his head resting against Liam's shoulder. Liam, though, was watching her, listening, hearing every word she was saying. She turned away. "Do what you have to do, Meredith," she said coldly. "I'll do what's right." And she hung up. A battle she wasn't ready for. The legal war began the next morning. Monroe had barely poured herself a cup of coffee when the first email came in. Subject: URGNT, Judicial Review Hearing Scheduled. She read the words twice, her pulse spiking. The stake was moving fast. She was being formally investigated. Her position as a judge was already on the chopping block. And if she lost, she wasn't just going to lose her career. She was going to lose Liam and Lucas. She clenched the edge of the counter, steadying herself. For the first time in her life, she wasn't in control of the outcome, but she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when these boys were counting on her. She turned, watching Liam carefully wrap a blanket around his sleeping brother. They had spent their entire lives fighting for survival. Now it was her turn to fight for them, even if it cost her everything. The fight for family. The morning was unusually cold, a crisp bite in the air that matched the icy tension building inside Evelyn Monroe's chest. She had spent the night reviewing legal documents, preparing arguments, and anticipating every possible counterattack from the state. Yet, no matter how much she prepared, there was one reality she couldn't ignore. The system wasn't designed for people like Liam and Lucas. And now, she was the one standing in its way. She sipped her coffee, but it tasted bitter, like defeat. A small voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Are we leaving?" Liam stood at the doorway to the kitchen, his eyes cautious. Behind him, Lucas clung to his brother's arm, half hidden, as if he was expecting bad news. Monroe forced herself to set the cup down, swallowing her emotions before they could show. "No," she said firmly. "You're staying right here." Lucas's little fingers tightened around Liam's sleeve. But the lady on the phone. Monroe's chest constricted. They had heard more than she realized. She knelt in front of them, her gaze steady. "You listen to me," she said softly. "I don't care what they say. You are not going anywhere without a fight." Lucas bit his lip. "Even if they say we have to." A flicker of something passed through Monroe's eyes. Rage. Determination. Love. Even then. The courtroom battle begins. By mid-morning, the hearing was set. Monroe wasn't used to being on this side of the bench. She had spent years presiding over cases, delivering rulings with the sharp precision of a scalpel. But now she sat at the defense table, facing a panel of judicial authorities, colleagues she had once called allies. And across from her, Meredith Clark. The woman looked victorious before the proceedings had even begun. "The matter before us today," one of the panel members announced, "is an inquiry into whether Judge Evelyn Monroe's decision to assume emergency guardianship of Liam and Lucas Patterson constitutes judicial misconduct." Monroe kept her expression unreadable. Clark stood, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, this case isn't about children. It's about a judge who violated every ethical standard in the book." Judge Monroe acted out of emotion, not the law. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Monroe remained silent, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Clark continued, relentless. She bypassed due process, ignored the legal protocols in place, and overstepped the authority of her position. If this decision is allowed to stand, what precedent does that set? She turned, eyes gleaming. Will every judge from now on get to pick and choose which children they personally want to save? The words stung, not because they were wrong, but because they were designed to make Monroe look selfish, like this wasn't about the boys at all. Monroe inhaled slowly, waiting for her turn. The moment it came, she rose. "I will not deny that I broke protocol," she said, "but let's not pretend this is about ethics." Her gaze swept across the room. "It's about two children who have been failed by the system at every turn. It's about the fact that despite multiple reports of abuse, despite evidence of neglect, no one stepped in. Not until it was almost too late." She turned to the panel, her voice steady. "The law is meant to protect the vulnerable. But what happens when it fails them? When the process meant to keep them safe only condemns them to more suffering?" Silence. Even Clark hesitated. Monroe pressed forward. "These boys have spent their entire lives being told they don't matter, that they're just another case number in a backlog of files. And when I looked into their eyes that day, I knew, if I didn't step in, no one else would." Her voice didn't waver. "I don't regret it, and I never will." A test of allegiances. The case wasn't just about Monroe. It was about the system itself, and the courtroom was divided. Some judges nodded, their expressions unreadable. Others looked uneasy. Monroe's reputation was powerful, but so was the law. She knew that. The question was, would it be enough? Just as the panel prepared to deliberate, the doors to the courtroom opened. A man in a suit walked in, his presence shifting the energy of the entire room. Officer Greg Harris. He stepped forward, his voice firm. "I have evidence," he said. "Evidence that the system failed these boys long before Judge Monroe stepped in." The room tensed, and for the first time since this battle began, Monroe saw something new in Clark's eyes. Doubt. Real doubt. The evidence that changed everything. Greg placed a thick file on the judge's bench. "These are reports," he said. "Dozens of them. Teachers, neighbors, even hospital staff, all reporting concerns about Liam and Lucas." He met Clark's gaze, and yet Child Services ignored them. A murmur broke out. Greg continued, unwavering. "These kids were locked in closets. They were left without food for days. When they tried to run away, they were beaten." His voice tightened, and no one did anything. A heavy silence fell. Greg turned to Monroe. "The only reason they're even standing here today, alive, is because she stepped in when no one else would." Monroe's throat burned. Clark's face had paled. The judges exchanged glances. The tide was shifting. But was it enough? The verdict. Hours passed. The deliberation dragged on. Monroe sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Liam and Lucas sat beside her, their small shoulders hunched. The weight of the moment pressed down on them all. Finally, the doors opened. Monroe stood. The head judge cleared his throat. "After reviewing all the evidence, we find that Judge Evelyn Monroe's actions were legally questionable, but morally justified." A pause. "We will not pursue removal from the bench." Monroe exhaled sharply. But the judge continued, "Temporary guardianship of Liam and Lucas will be reviewed under proper legal channels." Monroe nodded. It wasn't a complete victory, but it wasn't a loss either. And as she turned to the boys, something in Liam's eyes softened. Hope. For the first time in their lives, they had someone fighting for them. And she wasn't going anywhere. A home worth fighting for. The courtroom battle had ended, but for Evelyn Monroe, the war was far from over. The state had allowed Liam and Lucas to remain in her care. For now. But temporary guardianship wasn't enough. Not when she had spent every waking moment proving to these boys that they weren't disposable. She wasn't just trying to keep them safe. She was trying to give them a home. And she wasn't going to let the system take them away. The weight of uncertainty. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Monroe juggled her caseload while navigating home visits from social workers, court-mandated evaluations, and endless paperwork. Every day, she saw the same flicker of doubt in Liam's eyes. He had been through this before. So had Lucas. The foster homes, the promises, the crushing disappointment. No matter how much Monroe reassured them, She could feel their fear. They were waiting for the day she would give up, for the moment she would decide they were too much. She saw it when Liam hesitated before calling her for help with his homework. She saw it when Lucas flinched at the sound of a door slamming, his small body tensing like he expected to be yelled at. They weren't just waiting for abandonment. They were expecting it. And that realization shattered her. The social worker's visit. Monroe had dealt with countless social workers in her career, but none of them made her more nervous than Janice Holloway, the woman assigned to Liam and Lucas's case. Holloway was thorough. She inspected every corner of Monroe's home, flipping through medical records, interviewing the boys separately, and asking Monroe the same questions over and over. What makes you think you're suited to adopt two traumatized children? Monroe didn't flinch. Because I refuse to let them become another statistic. Holloway arched a brow. Do you think love is enough? Monroe exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. No, she admitted. Love is the foundation. But structure, therapy, patience, that's what will help them heal. Holloway studied her for a long moment. Then she closed her folder. We'll see. Lucas's nightmare. The night after Holloway's visit, Monroe was jolted awake by a scream. Not just any scream. A raw, heart-wrenching, terrified wail. She rushed down the hall and found Lucas curled in the corner of his bed, his tiny fists clenched around the sheets, his face drenched in tears. Monroe didn't hesitate. She knelt beside him, brushing the damp curls from his forehead. It's okay, she whispered. You're safe. Lucas hiccuped, his small chest heaving. I dreamed they took us back, he choked out. I dreamed they said we couldn't stay. Monroe felt something inside her break. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. No one is taking you anywhere, she murmured. Not as long as I have breath in my body. Lucas clung to her, his little fingers digging into her shirt. It was the first time he had ever reached for her first. And Monroe knew, in that moment, that she was his mother in every way that mattered. Now she just had to prove it to the courts. The custody hearing. 3 weeks later, Monroe stood before a different panel of judges. This time, fighting for full legal custody. Clark was back. Only this time, she wasn't as smug. The state has concerns about this arrangement, Clark argued. Judge Monroe is a single woman with an overwhelming career. Can she provide the emotional support these children need? Monroe kept her face neutral, but inside, she burned with frustration. She stood. I may be a judge, but first and foremost, I am a person who refuses to let two innocent children be thrown back into a broken system, she said. She turned, meeting the eyes of every judge on the panel. I have resources. I have the means. But more than that, I have commitment. These boys have spent their lives being treated like they don't matter. I am here to prove they do. She took a breath, then delivered her final blow. Liam and Lucas are not cases. They are children, and they deserve a home. A real home. Not another temporary placement. Not another promise that will be broken. If the law is truly designed to serve justice, then justice means giving them the stability they have been denied for so long. The courtroom was silent. Even Clark had nothing to say. The final verdict. Liam and Lucas sat in the back of the courtroom, their hands clenched together. Monroe wanted to reach for them, to tell them it would be okay. But she didn't know that yet. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the lead judge cleared his throat. After careful consideration, we find that Evelyn Monroe is fit and capable of providing a safe and loving home for Liam and Lucas Patterson. A pause. We grant full custody. Lucas gasped. Liam's eyes widened. Monroe's heart nearly stopped. She had won. No, they had won. The boys rushed toward her, and she barely had time to open her arms before they crashed into her, clinging tightly. Is it real? Liam whispered. We can stay. Monroe's throat tightened. She kissed the tops of their heads. "It's real," she promised. "You're home." For the first time in their lives, Liam and Lucas didn't have to wonder if someone would fight for them. Because now, they had a mother, and she wasn't going anywhere. Epilogue. A new beginning. Months passed. The adoption was finalized. Lucas started sleeping through the night. Liam stopped looking over his shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. They laughed more. They trusted more. And one day, out of the blue, Lucas tugged on Monroe's sleeve. She looked down, smiling. "What's up, kiddo?" His tiny face scrunched in concentration. Then, in the softest voice, he whispered, "Mom." Monroe's heart nearly burst. She knelt, cupping his face. "Yeah, baby." Lucas beamed. "I love you." Tears burned her eyes. She pulled him close, holding him as tightly as she could. "I love you too," she whispered. And for the first time, she wasn't just Evelyn Monroe. She was their mother. Forever.